My name is Peter Cziraki. I'm at the University of Toronto, and I'm here to talk about a paper that's joint work with Mochi Hrunshu, who's at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and our paper is on CEO turnover and volatility under long-term employment contracts. Our paper looks at the effects of long-term CEO contracts. So taking a step back, what are long-term CEO contracts? A significant fraction of S&P 500 companies' CEOs, chief executive officers, are employed under fixed-term contract, which means that the contract sets out that the CEO will be the employee of the company, will be the CEO of the company for 5 years. And this is the first paper to investigate what these contracts actually do in terms of incentivizing CEOs and what the effects are on corporate policies. In particular, the paper seeks to answer two questions. One is, how do these contracts function? And the second one is, what are the implications for corporate policies? And in particular, the corporate policy that we look at is risk-taking and the resulting effect on corporate investment and the riskiness of the firm's stock. So let me summarize what we find. In the first question, we find that in general, contracts are not empty promises. So the way that the contract is structured, the implication of a long-term contract is that whenever the CEO is fired, previous to the expiration of the contract, the firm must pay the CEO an amount of severance that is proportional to the time left on the contract. So we can think of this as a commitment device. The firm commits to not firing the CEO. What they're saying is, look, if we fire you prematurely, we're going to pay you a much higher amount of severance. And what we show in the paper for the first time is that the remaining time under the CEO's contract is a very good predictor of whether the CEO turns over or not. In particular, each year that a CEO has remaining on their contract, each additional year, translates into an about 3.5% less CEO turnover probability, where we know that the average CEO turnover probability is about 11 to 12% in our sample, so this is an economically significant amount. So what we conclude is that contracts are not empty promises. Now, the other thing that we find, and this is, once again, this goes to the motivation of why does the firm offer these contracts, is that you could think of the contract as a commitment device. And in particular, the intuition is that the firm may want the CEO to undertake policies that are risky, that are somewhat exploratory. And so the main intuition is that the firm says, look, we're going to give you a 5-year term. If in the first couple of years things are not going so well, we're going to sit tight, we're going to be patient with you and allow you to to roll out these policies. Now, consistent with this, not only do we find that the turnover is sensitive to the time remaining on the contract, but also that worse performance during the first couple of years of the contract is much better tolerated than worse performance later in the contract. So turnover performance sensitivity is much higher when the contract is close to expiration as opposed to at the beginning of the contract. And then in the second step, so now having established that contracts actually have bite, that contracts are not empty promises, in the second part of the paper, we take a step back and we say, okay, now given that contracts are not empty promises and CEOs are probably aware of this, how do they alter the corporate policies that they themselves take? And the most obvious candidate that we thought to look at was risk. So in particular, the intuition that we're after here is to say, well, when would the CEO like to take more risk as opposed to less risk? The idea is that if the CEO knows that underperforming will be better tolerated in the first couple of years of the contract, it is probably during this time that they will start experimenting a little bit more and take projects that are potentially risky, and they might have high payoffs in the long run, but in the short run they look like they might engender some risk. And so this is exactly what we find. So what we find is that the risk measured by the volatility of the returns on the firm's stock is very highly correlated with the time remaining under the contract. In particular, risk is much higher when the remaining time under contract is high, and risk diminishes over the duration of the contract. As the contract is closer to expiration, it appears that CEOs take projects that are less risky. An important consideration, however, is that a lot of other things change over time. CEOs get older, CEOs spend more time on the job, so they might get more confident. So an important test, an important result in our paper that we use to confirm that this is about the time remaining under contract is we use a sample of CEOs whose contracts are renewed. And so what happens on contract renewal is that, let's say you have a 5-year contract, the remaining time under contract changes sharply because once the contract expires, you basically have 0 time left on your contract, but at expiration, upon renewal, the contract resets. So from 0 years, we once again go back to 5 years. And if this is about remaining time on the contract, what we should see is that the risk goes back up and capital expenditures and things that are associated with more risky policies once again increase. And this is exactly what we find. What we find is that around contract expiration, volatility increases by about 23 basis points, which is 15% of the standard deviation of volatility. Finally, because this is a story about CEOs wanting to retain their jobs, the last thing that we look at is cross-sectional cuts of CEOs who might be more afraid to lose their jobs as opposed to CEOs who might be less afraid to lose their jobs. So 2 results that we think are important and that once again go in this direction is that the results are much stronger for young CEOs. So as a younger CEO, relatively speaking, you have much more time that you will typically spend working. So this means that you are much more averse to getting dismissed as opposed to somebody who's very close to retirement anyway. And we find a similar effect for CEOs who are not the founder of the firm, who are probably much more averse to getting dismissed, as opposed to CEOs who are a founder of the firm and they've already proven themselves. Let me talk now about what led us to start this project. So I think there were 2 very compelling things that we saw in the literature that we thought to address. The first one is we wanted to better understand how CEOs make decisions on the riskiness of corporate policies. So in particular, there has been a lot of debate in the literature saying CEOs' incentives are too short-term, they don't want to experiment. Some people said there was excessive risk-taking on part of CEOs in the financial crisis. If you think about the large banks, they were getting into these risky investments. So what we wanted to understand better is taking a step back and saying, suppose that now you're the shareholder, suppose that now you're the board of directors that represents the interests of shareholders. What measures do you have that could potentially get the CEOs to take more risk or to take less risk, right? So what do you have on your dashboard? What buttons are there that you could press? And so the second part that we thought was interesting and we thought that there was a little bit of a gap is one thing that has been studied and is very well understood and potentially there's more work on in the literature is everybody understands compensation packages. So people in the literature have looked at the mix between stock and options in the CEO's compensation package, the vesting periods of the options within the CEO's compensation package. And we said, well, compensation, and especially these option-like instruments, they're excellent to give people incentives on the upside, to say, well, look, if the stock price goes up beyond a certain level, you're going to make a lot of money. But the other thing that we need to consider is that this is contingent upon the CEO staying in office. So if you're terminated, you're looking at a large drop in your compensation, right? And you're looking at a large drop overall in your employment options, which is something that we also prove in the paper. We also provide evidence of in the paper for our sample CEOs, but this is generally well understood. So what we said is, aren't there other instruments other than compensation that the shareholders could also use? And in particular, instruments that help CEOs mitigate the downside. So this is where we brought in contracts, where we said this is a good measure, this is a good instrument to provide CEOs downside protection. So instead of saying, look, if the stock price reaches a certain target, if you really manage to get the stock price up, something good will happen. We're saying if something doesn't go as planned, we're still going to be patient. And so this is really where we started out looking at contracts. And once we had this idea, we collected a large sample of CEO contracts, almost 4,000 CEO contracts that were first machine read and then hand collected in parts by excellent research assistants that we rely on. And I think that this is currently the largest sample of executive employment contracts in the literature. So thinking about future directions that this research agenda could take, I think the most promising aspect perhaps of our paper, if I may say that, is that there is other aspects of contracting between the board of directors and the CEO other than compensation. And I think that our work aims to show that setting a fixed term in the contract is something that is useful, is something that has potentially real implications. It's something that affects CEO behavior. And I think, in general, this could be part of a broader agenda where we look at aspects of firm CEO contracts other than compensation. The reason that we decided to submit this work to the Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis is because a lot of excellent and highly cited work on similar topics, on CEO contracts, on CEO compensation, and on top executive labor markets in general came out in the Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis, and members of the editorial team have a lot of expertise in this area, so we thought that the paper would get very insightful comments in the review process, and this indeed turned out to be the case. I think in the first round we received a very focused and, if I may say, very candid referee report, and we thought that the main points of the referee report were that we need to tie much better our empirical results to existing theories of top executive labor markets and CEO incentives. And luckily, the editorial team deemed that we managed to deliver on this, and the paper is now conditionally accepted at the journal. And I think currently the main line of comment is that we now need to focus the paper and shorten it to perhaps better retain the attention of the readers and move things to online appendices. I think that for other researchers, this data collection effort that we did could be useful, and we hope to inspire other work along these lines, and eventually we also hope to make our data available to other researchers.